So let's talk through every single faction in Warhammer 40k and round up a whole bunch of possibilities for model releases, what could Games Workshop come out with, and what do people want to see. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking 40k model releases, and for this one I thought we'd talk about future hopes and possibilities for basically all of the Warhammer 40k factions, rounding up something between a wish list, fan desires, and what Games Workshop might plausibly come out with, plus talking about any other minor hints from the future that we might have had. It certainly feels like since I last made a full video like this around a year and a half ago, Games Workshop has already ticked off a fair amount of the possibilities, and it'll certainly be interesting to see which of these get realised in the future and which don't. In any case though, let's jump into it. We'll talk through the Imperium first, then the Chaos, then the Xenos, and let me know what you'd most like to see for your army, link down in the video description, particularly anything that I might not have thought of. I'm sure I'll miss a few things along the way. Jumping straight into it, and let's start with Games Workshop's favourite poster boys in the Space Marines. The last several editions has largely been the story of them gradually updating their firstborn range to their Primaris one, plus adding in a bunch of other things along the way, and that seems very unlikely to slow down given that they're Games Workshop's best sellers and have a whole bunch of factions basically sort of dependent on them, so lots of chance to sell kits to say things like Blood Angels and Black Templar players. It seems that we're pretty likely to get more models for them in the future. We recently just had the new drop pod unveiled, but beyond that it looks like Space Marines are shaping up for a release wave, probably both in late 10th edition and also at the launch for 11th in 2026, so it seems likely we'll be getting a whole bunch more Primaris and Power armour over the next year or so. With their massive range and a whole bunch of things that have been removed from it, they do feel like they've got a lot of really obvious things. Vanguard Veterans and the Terminator Assault Squad seem like the single most obvious things based on kits that they've already done. Still in the Codex, and they could drop at any time really. Maybe the other one that's quite so obviously going to be staying and eventually might get a drop pod like update would be the Land Raider. I'd guess they probably wouldn't mess with the design too much, but just try and give it a sharper model with some Primaris crew probably. Otherwise loads of other possibilities for things they could update from the Firstborn, maybe an artillery and siege tank, Whirlwind and Vindicator style. More Redemptor Dreadnoughts seem odds on to me in the long term, perhaps a Venerable one and a Siege Dreadnought somewhat like the Ironclad, and then perhaps a bunch of things that they could potentially redo if they want to but seem a bit less certain than the previous. They could have a tactical squad either as an upgrade for intercessors or just a side-by-side troop option. They could keep Devastators around if they wanted to make them distinct from the Desolation squad. Centurions really feel like they could get updated, stay or go. I feel like the Rhino could be iconic enough that they just give an updated version as opposed to phase it out, given how relevant it is to so many armies, and they could dig up some of the things that they phased out in the past, things like the Landspeeder Storm, Thunderfire Cannon or Scout Bikes. Otherwise, for model releases for the Primaris, a couple of kits that really stand out as wanting multi-part kits at some stage could be the Suppressors and the Outriders. Both of those a little bit depressingly monopose, and the Suppressors you can't even buy outside of a combi box set. I think people were more surprised that they didn't get a standalone release with a weapon option at some stage. For range gaps for the Primaris, they could do their Overlord gunship, which is a big flyer that was sort of teased and mentioned in the lore quite a bit, though I'm sure some people would enjoy them living up to the meme of the plastic Thunderhawk. You could do a Primaris Super Heavy, similar to the Astrius maybe, or a completely different design. I'm sure there's all sorts of flavours of infantry and tanks they could cook up if they wanted to. Maybe seeing as they've done Plasma Melter and Flamer armed units, they could do a Grav squad as the last of the main Space Marine special weapon types, and you could make infantry variants for the different Codex chapters. It would be nice to see some Imperial Fists armed with Breacher shields, or some sort of artisanal immolation from the Salamanders perhaps. Loads of possibilities for Space Marine mainline releases, though they've got probably far more character options, if anything, with the Space Marine format often being to have, say, captains, lieutenants, librarians, and chaplains for most of their different armour classes. That basically means they could do one of those for everything from Terminators, Jump Packs, Gravis, or biker-mounted ones. And if you just wanted to play fill in all the gaps with those, that'd already be more HQ choices than a lot of other 40k factions have in general. I'd kind of guess they probably won't actually ever get round to doing all of them, but could certainly keep variants of them trotting out with each new Space Marine release that turns up. Perhaps a generic chapter master model could be another interesting option, though it might be a bit of an unusual one, given they usually tend to be very tied with the personality of their chapter. Finally, for Marine characters, there's a massive amount of named characters that they could do new sculpts for. The most obvious ones feel like Cato Sicarius, Pedro Cantor, Darnath Lysander, and Vulcan Hestan, the remaining fine cast characters that are in Codex Space Marines. They did conspicuously stay around, which I feel like is probably a soft hint that they are going to get updates at some point. Lots of other options they could dig into, White Scars Bikers, or things like Gabriel Angelos, Sergeant Telemon or Tiberos the Red Wake. And of course at some point I'm sure we'll get some more Lawless Primarchs turning up. I'd be very surprised if Lehman Russ wasn't next, but we could be getting Rogol Dawn, Vulcan, Corvus Corax turn up, or Jagatai Khan. Overall, Games Workshop still seem to have just a ridiculous amount of Space Marine kits that they could throw at us, never mind any curveballs or surprises, and does seem that we might be getting some more kind of soon. They basically tease individual codex things for the Raven Guard, Salamanders, and Imperial Fists, which I guess would mean at least one new model for those, so it could be those named characters and more. And there was a Primaris engine in the Rumour engine as well, which could be some sort of tank speeder or jet bike, though I guess could be for divergent chapters potentially. Moving on from many possibilities for Space Marines though, the Astra Militarum are again a faction with a long legacy and have a ton of things that seem kind of obvious that they could add into the range or dig up from the faction's past. They've already had their big release wave for 10th edition with the Krieg options, and given that they redid Cadians and then added Plastic Krieg into the mix, the Kaschan Jungle Fighters have kind of been crying out for an update ever since they were released really. Compared with the initial infantry release that they had, the Command Squad was a big upgrade, and they've shown they can do far better sculpts for Kaschans with the Colonel and the Sergeant miniatures they did in the not too distant past. Maybe the Guard will continue to eat good into 11th edition, first having Cadians, then having Krieg, then having Kaschans. If so, I'll probably hope for the Core 3 kits with Infantry Command and Heavy Weapons, and then maybe Einhand Strachan and Sergeant Harker. That's feel like the bare minimum, though I guess it's possible they could add some extra things for further options for the Kaschans to expand their range. Otherwise, for possibilities, there's loads more. A motorcycle unit or maybe a light buggy one could fit in fairly well. Bikes would certainly feel like they'd fit in fairly well for 20th century army vibes. And it was interesting that they'd returned the Taurus Venator to Necromunda as a sort of light buggy type thing. That used to be a Forge World option for the Guard, so I guess they could release a Guard version if they'd like. Otherwise, it'd be really nice to see some representation for other regiments. Kaschans probably feel like the most obvious first, but I feel like you could do a really good kill team kit for things like Vostroyons, Armageddon Steel Legion, Mordians, Valhallans or Talon. A new miniature for Commissar Yarrick would certainly be greeted with a warm reception. Depends on whether Games Workshop sticking to the lore that he died in action. Though if they were going to bring him back, the narrative focus on Armageddon probably would have been a prime chance to. Otherwise, the Guard did recently lose quite a lot of different units: conscripts, veterans, special weapon squads, and Weird Vein Psychers. The first three all removed just as there was no individual kit sold for them. That's definitely something that Games Workshop could start selling if they really wanted to. The Psychers were just phased out, just not having new models. Again, definitely possible to expand something for the Telepathica. Finally, Guard had an enormous Forge World range, which got gradually wound down, and then a whole bunch going to Legends all at once. The Cyclops Demolition Vehicle is one of the only ones that's left, and I guess you could make that plastic. Otherwise, the Hades Breaching Drill, maybe the Trojan Support Vehicle, some of the fighter aircrafts like Thunderbolts or Lightnings, all could be good possibilities, and there's definitely the possibility for more Krieg options if they'd like to give them another release wave at some point in the distant future. Their Centaur, the Mars Alpha Ross, Grenadiers, or maybe a generic Death Rider character. I feel like maybe a standalone Marshal or generic Death Rider character might be one of the more likely things that could show up for them, but I can't really see them getting another major release wave quite so close to the one that they've had. Feels like Kaschans would maybe be the most obvious thing that Games Workshop probably should update though. Fingers crossed for 11th edition there. Next up, for the Adeptus Mechanicus, they got some good releases toward the end of 8th edition, though haven't had much since. And again, they do feel like they're a faction with a lot of solid possibilities. Probably the most obvious one is all the Heresy era tech that's often looked at with a whole load of tech jealousy from the 40k AdMech players. Perhaps in particular more classes of robot and automata to go alongside the Castellan robots. I'm sure they quite like something bigger and maybe Thanatar class, or maybe some of the smaller cyborg style ones. And to be honest, for them I feel like there's no real enormously strong reason why they couldn't port those to 40k, though it seems their decision has been to try and keep the Horus Heresy Mechanicum range separate from the 40k Mechanicus. Otherwise, for possibilities, they could do the Titan Guard units in plastic, the Secutari ones. They had Forge World rules for 40k, but they sent them to the Legends of the Horus Heresy. You could have a Stratos hovering automata. You could have a massive self-propelled gun thing like the Ordinatus from the Heresy era. Maybe the return of a Terax drill to burrow up and deliver some Skitarii into the fight. And remember that there was some good art of the AdMech going mining for Blackstone alongside the Pariah Nexus narrative with Call invading that. A great big crawling beam thing and a mining looking tech priest. Probably unlikely to be 40k units, but they have teased things in the art before. Seems that we're getting one release in at least the fairly near future though, with the Servitor Battleclade. Nice to see a squad of actual generic Servitors return to the battlefields of 40k. It felt like a weird option for the army not to be able to have, just given how iconic they are in the lore. Compared with the previous sort of mechanic style ones, these ones are more battle armed ones with phosphor weapons, a couple of big guns with an arc rifle and a heavy bolter, and some other specialist ones. Before we move on to the other Imperium and beyond, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. That's one option to get terrain for an easy to store and transport 40k battlefield, with their own slightly unusual but kind of fun folding cardboard style. The idea behind this is that you basically have a 3x4 grid of cardboard tiles. When you set up the battlefield, each one of them unfolds and up pops a building of one sort or another. So basically assemble yourself a little town worth of cardboard terrain and be good to go with the battlefield very quickly. The biggest advantage and selling point of it is that it can all fold flat and then fit within a box set the same size as a normal board game. Could be an interesting option for people where space is limited and you don't have loads of space to store a more bulky set, or if you're wanting to transport it from place to place to say go around and play some games at someone else's house. There are some trade-offs with the whole folding cardboard design style thing. It is very different to most other terrain sets out there. I'll talk through a few of those at the end of the video, so stick around or check there if you'd like to hear more. There'll be links down in the video description though if you want to take a look over their various options with the different styles in their range. And of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring this video. Moving on, we've got the Adepta Sororitas. I feel like they're a faction where it's a little bit less obvious with a massive amount of units they could do next, though a few things maybe do stick out. They got their Jump Cannoness for 10th edition, which was a pretty reasonable add-in as a missing option if they had to get a character miniature, and they've also had that recently released Sanctifier's Warband. From taking examples from units they could field in the past, maybe some of the more obvious ones feel like the Crusaders and Death Cult Assassins, more going down the sort of Ministorum Ecclesiarchy Zealots, and not really Battle Sisters in themselves though, and I feel like the actual Battle Sister releases tend to be a lot more popular than Ecclesiarchy things on the whole. Crusaders could make a nice kill team though if they fancied it. They feel like another unit that could apply to a bunch of different armies if they wanted to allow them to. The Imperial Guard used to be able to field them and they feel appropriate for the Agents of the Imperium as well. Otherwise for the actual Battle Sisters, maybe a regular Celestian squad could be one of the most obvious. Veteran Sisters armed with bolters as opposed to the close combat Sacrosants. They had those in the roster until the start of 10th. And otherwise could just go down some other common 40k tropes, maybe doing a flyer model or a mounted biker unit if they wanted to do something a bit more new. The Celestian Sacrosant Avalyn miniature they came out with a limited edition release for was a pretty awesome model as well. Feels like that would be quite a nice one to just add into the range full stop if they chose to bring it back at some point in the future. The Sanctifier's Warband is still waiting for its release at this point, perhaps a slightly ragtag bunch of Ecclesiarchy Zealots with a bunch of specialists, and they do have one Death Cult Assassin there. Looks like there'll be a rival for the Dominions in their current form, bringing a whole bunch of close-range flame weapons to the table. For the Adeptus Custodes, their most obvious things on the wish list is to get their Forge World range in plastic. It's maybe a bit unfortunate for them at the moment that the Games Workshop plastics are just pretty great value in terms of, say, money for points on the board, whereas Forge World is quite the opposite. It just means they don't really feel like they've got a complete faction army. If going solely by plastic, you're missing things like their ranged troops like the Sagittarium Guard, their unique Dreadnought sculpts, which are so much better than the regular Venerable one, their transport vehicle in the Coronis Grav Carrier and its variant tank, the Jump Infantry Venatari, and a few others. These guys are almost guaranteed to get a refresh and new plastic sculpts at some point, just due to Games Workshop having gone round the various sub-factions of the Horus Heresy and having redone most of them at this point to some extent. We've had lots of plastic resculpts for Solar Auxilia, Mechanicum and the Knights, and that really just leaves Custodes as the most obvious one to have their Forge World range converted to plastic. My big hope, if and when they choose to do that, will be that the Forge World resculpted units just get included in the 40k codex and you just use the models for Heresy and 40k equally, though for whatever reason it doesn't seem to be the way that Games Workshop does things these days. Otherwise, for another obvious thing they could do would be to expand the Sisters of Silence range for 40k. They sort of build them as Talons of the Emperor to start with, which just doesn't really look so good, seeing as the Custodes have far more kits, and the Sisters only really have 1.5 between their troops and a layer. They could give them the transport they have in Heresy, and the rules that they wrote for the new Heresy edition included a bunch of other interesting things. An intriguing one was Sisters of Silence on bikes, which they'd never had before, and that seems very likely to be teasing a new miniature that would come out when Custodes eventually do start to see plastics. For the Grey Knights, Games Workshop didn't really live up to expectations with their release of the upgrade sprue for the current Dread Knight. The parts themselves are nice enough, a massive great big quad melter is quite fun, as is the Mason Flail, but for a faction that's kind of expecting a full-scale update at some point sooner or later, it maybe doesn't feel like the single most helpful thing. Even something like a resculpt for, say, Brother Captain Stern or something might have been preferred by some. Games Workshop seem to have been going around the different Divergent chapters. We've had Black Templars, Dark Angels, Blood Angels, and now Space Wolves all get the Primaris treatment over the course of 9th and 10th. It feels like Grey Knights are probably towards the end of that conveyor belt, so fingers crossed that 11th edition could be the one. It's not like Grey Knights have a ton of kits either, so they could get a long way just literally by redoing the Terminators and Power Armor Marines, and pairing that with some character sculpts. Stern and Drago will be really good ones. I think people would quite like some Grey Knight specific infantry characters to get released, maybe a new Brother Captain or Grandmaster in Terminator armour, or perhaps a generic power armoured Brotherhood champion. I think at least a fair few people would have been relatively happy to see the Dread Knight get an update if they did do a big range refresh like that, but now they've just released an upgrade sprue for it, it kind of seems a bit less likely. Though I guess there is some past precedent to them doing things like that. We had the Cadian shock troops get an upgrade sprue and then get replaced by new ones not too long after. For the Imperial Knights, their codex is coming fairly soon. Definitely lots of things they could do for them, with a faction with only 3 mainline 40k plastic kits. Again, like the Custodes, they could convert more of their Heresy era things into plastics, things like the Cerastus Knight Atropos, the Moirax, and the Questors Megara and Styrex. I don't know if they'd go as far as the Aircasters, that would be an absolutely enormous kit, probably the single biggest plastic kit Games Workshop could make, though I guess these would all have their release more mainstream aimed at the Horus Heresy and have that packaging on the box sets, though I feel like the real dream would be to have them included in the 40k codex and just literally become part of the range, as opposed to always having to keep their distance in the Forge World indexes. If they just get them separate though, then you could just dream up any other flavour of Knight chassis for Warhammer 40k, maybe a Sanctic Psycho Knight to be the mirror of the Abominant for the Chaos, perhaps a close range Siege Knight, an Armiger kit expansion, maybe with a chain cannon like the Chaos gets. I feel like there's always the possibility for them to add some, say, feudal 40k Night World men-at-arms. I don't know if they really want to do that, seeing as their main selling point is being a whole faction of super heavy walkers and their vassals, but they often tend to ally in agents anyway. That might be something to have a bit more knight appropriate if they want to get some foot troops on the go. Speaking of the Inquisition and the Imperial Agents, they've only recently become a thing in Warhammer 40k, and maybe with just one edition worth of history. It kind of remains to be seen whether Games Workshop's actually going to still treat them as a standalone army. They could just get reinterpreted back to more distinctly be allies in 11th edition for all we know. They still have one obvious named Inquisitor to redo in Inquisitor Karamazov. He'd be fun to get an update on his Throne of Judgment, though hopefully done a fair bit better than Kotias was, and he seems a lot more likely than say the Forge World ones like Solomon Locke and Hector Rex. Inquisitor Eisenhorn is the other one that was removed, and if anything I feel like people actually might care more about him given that he's got the entire lore behind him and lots of fans from the novels. A generic Inquisitor kit feels like it's a really lacking option for the army. Kind of weird that they've released 2 sort of generic ones with the Erasmus Cartavolnus one and Inquisitor Ostromandius for Warhammer Plus, but for some reason neither of those has been added to the range as a standard Inquisitor for the more generic datasheet for non-named ones. Otherwise you could do things like Inquisitorial Stormtroopers, though even just allowing them to field Tempestus Scions maybe wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, and they could redo the Jokairo and Demon Host, which were also removed in the 10th edition Agents Codex. If they want to make them into a bit more of a standalone army and actually function as a faction, which as mentioned doesn't necessarily seem very clear, they really would need some sort of anti-tank, whether it's better rules for requisitioning things from the stuff that they might draw from, or something standalone with heavy weapons. At the moment they just can't really compete too well with tank and monster spam armies as they are currently. Finally, for a weird possible aside, they could put Legion of the Damned here if they wanted to do them. I guess they'd turn up here as weird allied spectral space marines, that maybe seems like a little bit of an unlikely one for Games Workshop to do at this point. Then finally for the Imperium, we've got the various flavours of Divergent Chapter Space Marines. The Black Templars had a fairly completist range refresh towards the later stages of 9th edition. Basically all the things that I would have expected them to get turned up then. We don't know their character release for 10th edition yet, though it seems more likely to be a token character as opposed to anything big and exciting. For options there, they could do something like a generic Chaplain sculpt given how known they are for them. They've already got a unique Marshal and Castellan for their Captain and Lieutenant. And interestingly, we got a teaser that looked like it could be for Templars from the Rumour Engine. Looks like the skull of a Navigator with their third eye on a sort of Templar-style iron halo. I don't know if that could imply another Marshal, maybe a Terminator one, if that's the theme of 10th edition, or maybe it could be part of a banner for an Ancient. When I asked Templar players in a community post, the most specific things were something like a Templar-specific Dreadnought. That could be a fun way to add an all very lore-appropriate big heavy hitter to the army. Or maybe go for some more elites and some Sword Brethren Terminators, which I'm sure would look pretty epic if they go something similar to the Deathwing Knights. For the Blood Angels, they maybe have one of the least popular range refreshes of 10th edition so far. For the most part, the characters were generally received kind of okay, though some divided opinion. Though both their squad updates in the Sanguinary Guard and the Death Company left a lot to be desired in their own ways. For me, I'd rate the Death Company getting an actual model release being the top priority for them. Blood Angels have 2 well-known infantry units, it just seems kind of silly. for one of those two to basically just be represented by bog standard intercessors. Literally the only difference between them is some black paint, maybe some transfers, and one Eviscerator and Inferno pistol added to the squad. It really isn't a Death Company kit, and something maybe similar to the updated Grey Hunters or Blood Claws would have been a lot better received, I think. My guess is literally just from their release patterns that the Intercessor option is probably a stopgap, and we will see an actual Death Company kit sometime in the future. I'm really hoping for 11th edition, though I guess we'll see. Otherwise, there's a few units that got removed that they could return. The Librarian Dreadnought, one actual dedicated Death Company Dreadnought model. Brother Corbulo could come back, though kind of seems unlikely, and I feel like the Sanguinary Priest model takes some nods from him, and the Bar Predator maybe has a slightly uncertain fate. Likely it needs a new model, or probably faces retirement in 11th if they do phase out things like Predators and have Gladiators as their successor. Maybe the most tongue-in-cheek answer could be to take the Sanguinary Guard back and have another go. For the Dark Angels, they basically got one wing of their army updated for 10th. It was basically a Deathwing update with Belial, the Deathwing Knights, and some upgrades to go with the generic Terminators to make them about Deathwing. Nothing at all for the Black-clad Bikers, which probably means that 11th is odds on to be the Ravenwing update, as just can't really see many Firstborn sticky around after 11th has been and gone. If you had to speculate what they do for the Ravenwing, Samael himself and the Black Knights seem the absolute most likely and near guaranteed ones. If they push the boat out a little bit beyond that, probably some sort of Storm Speeder variant. They could go for things similar to the Dark Shroud and Land Speeder Vengeance, or even do some sort of new version of the Talon Master. I'd be kind of surprised if they updated the planes really, and I wouldn't really say that they need it either. I wouldn't be optimistic about the survival of the Ravenwing command squad though, given what happens to the Deathwing one. Otherwise for Dark Angels things, Ezekiel seems really quite likely to turn up. He's still cast in metal, and besides Samael was the other big character that didn't get a refresh. And well, that's probably enough to be getting on with. There's definitely other possibilities that they could do, maybe a generic Company Master or Interrogator Chaplain model. That might mirror what the Black Templars and Blood Angels have got somewhat. They've both got some generic leaders mixed in with all their named characters. For the Space Wolves, they've got their big army range coming soon, spearheaded by the army set itself, which is likely odds on not to be too very far away at this point. They've got not one but two sets of troops, the Grey Hunters and Blood Claws. Nice to see both of them actually get dedicated Primaris sculpts, and it appears that they could be two different kits given their very different legs. It certainly makes me wish they'd put in a bit of effort like this with the Death Company. Then there's two generic characters revealed, a Wolf Priest, Space Wolf Chaplain pretty much, and a Wolfguard Battle Leader on foot. And then we've basically got the new version of the Wolfguard on foot, billed as Wolfguard Head Takers with axes and shields or axe and sword, and accompanied what I guess will be the new version of Fenrisian Wolves pretty much. Apparently you fielded them as two separate units. Otherwise for Space Wolves, the Terminators seem like one of the most likely things to appear. There's one of them on the Codex cover that they teased. I'm not sure if this is a generic one or a Wolf Lord, plus they did differentiate as the Head Takers as just one type of Wolfguard. Logan Grimnar seems like the other pretty much guaranteed one. No way they're doing a Space Wolf range refresh without redoing the Chapter Master. He did have some new art teased of him as well. And then probably the others that I guess will be most likely could be Beyond the Fellhanders and maybe Njal Stormcaller. Maybe a little bit less guaranteed, but they both feel like really big central characters in the Codex. Otherwise, there's a massive amount of possibility for what could redone, just stay as they are, or be outright dropped. They've got other generic characters like the Wolf Lord mounted ones, and they've got many more named ones. I guess Lucas the Trickster probably isn't getting an update, given that he resembles the Bloodclaw Sergeant in the model. There's plenty more though, like Arjak Rockfist and the named Wolf Lords. Then there's their more overtly wolfy things, the Thunderwolves and the Wolfen. I feel like Wolfen are maybe more guaranteed to stay, just given their prevalence in the Space Wolf lore. Might keep the same models or might get new ones. Thunderwolves maybe feel a little bit less certain, but I'm sure there would be howls of disappointment if they went away. Otherwise, if a Bjorn kit does materialise, which isn't guaranteed, Games Workshop don't seem to be quite so keen to make independent characters into multi-builds these days. It wouldn't necessarily still build Murderfang or the other Wolf Dread variants. Finally, Leman Russ suddenly seems to be the single most odds-on Primarch to return next. Maybe the Wolf King will indeed grace us with his presence in the upcoming Codex, or perhaps he might be saved for something like an End Edition campaign as the Lion was. Finally for the Imperium, we've got the Deathwatch, and Games Workshop haven't really been treating them too well recently. Rather than giving them a model release in 10th edition and keeping them with a codex, they sort of tried to soft remove them by consolidating them in with Imperial Agents, so you couldn't really field them alongside other Space Marines properly, and making their rules kind of terrible in the process. Then basically looks like they kind of caved to fan pressure, plus maybe the embarrassment of having Deathwatch really prominently feature in Space Marine 2 and other cool bits of media and animation, and they allowed them to survive with the digital index, and even brought back the mixed squad Primaris kill teams with far more interesting rules, which I certainly hope is how they might stay into the future. Again, if Games Workshop are going through all the divergent chapters and eventually doing Primaris refreshes of them, feels like Deathwatch will be on the list, but probably last after Grey Knights if I had to guess. Though on the other hand, it wouldn't really take much to redo the kits they have at the moment. They've only really got the Deathwatch veterans, Watchmaster and Captain Artemis. I can't really see that the Corvus Blackstar would need redoing, and that thing would just more want an exemption from Games Workshop's flies must be terrible in game sort of policy that they've had going in 10th. Moving on to the Heretics next though, and for the Chaos Space Marines, they had relatively good releases both in 8th and 9th, and they did update a fair bit of their Aging Plastic range. From units in the Codex, maybe two of the most obvious might be the Chaos Bikers and Huron Blackheart. It's perhaps a bit of a surprise that the Monopose Chaos Bikers have lasted quite this long, to be honest. I certainly expect them to have an Outrider style redo at some stage in the future. They were part of the rumour compilation for things that would turn up in 9th, but then they wound up being absent from the list of other things that were predicted and wound up coming true. Otherwise, with Lucius being redone, Huron Blackheart is now the oldest character in the Codex and currently doesn't even have his model on sale, and he feels like he could be a prime target for either a single character release if they weren't doing much for the next edition, or something like an end edition campaign feature. He does represent the head of quite a big force in the galaxy with those red Corsairs. Otherwise, for older kits that got rotated out, the Mutilators could make a return. I guess they could do a multi-part Obliterator set if they wanted to, and the Exalted Champion could come back if they wanted. He wouldn't even need a new miniature, just re-releasing the old one. Otherwise, I wonder if they'd get around to upscaling the Terminators to match the current Space Marine ones at some point. They're kind of a bit unfortunate as they had them redone in 8th edition, so aren't really particularly old models at this point. Otherwise, for the Chaos Space Marines, I think a lot of people would enjoy an expansion of the other non-deity legions, which even compared with the Codex Space Marine chapters have had very little representation. People absolutely loved the Night Lords upgrade sprue that they came out with, probably the single most popular upgrade sprue that they've released in a kill team box set up to now. If they managed to give Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors and Word Bearers and the rest one named character and one upgrade sprue like that, I feel like that would go a long way to realising their flavour in 40k and not just for Heresy. There's also several traitor Primarchs that could be redone as well, Lorgar and Perturabo maybe being the two most obvious. They're both existent threats in Warhammer 40k, and now Fulgrim's happened. They're perhaps potentially next on the list for the Chaos Primarchs, and I feel like Alpharius might be the next most likely after that, given that not being dead when you expect him to be is maybe the entire thing about him. Fallen could be another option as well, and maybe a miniature for Luther if they wanted. Fallen Chaos Space Marines could be quite nice for a kill team option if they wanted to dig into that. For the Death Guard, looks like their only miniature release for 10th edition is going to be the Lord of Poxes, a Miasma Generator, a great big Plague Blade, and apparently some rules that might make Plague Marines untargetable at long range. Essentially, he's the Death Guard Lord in Power Armor, which was something that was kind of missing from their range. They were using the generic sculpt before. Death Guard are easily the best realised of the Deity Legions, with a bunch of model options and lots of demon engines, and I feel like it's unlikely they'll get masses of stuff until the others all catch up. But when I've seen talk about what Death Guard players are like, things like a possessed equivalent, maybe similar to 8-bound or Flawless Blades, as they could feel Death Guard possessed before. A unique Hellbrute could be fun, or maybe some different options for how to field Plague Marines, perhaps expanding the main box set up to 10 with an extra sprue or something, or giving them a Havoc equivalent so the rank and file infantry can do something to crack tanks at range. Otherwise, a re-release of the Lord of Contagion from the Dark Imperium box set I think will be liked by quite a few people. The Lord Felthius one just doesn't really compare model-wise, in my opinion. I guess we'll find out about a new combat patrol in the not too distant future, which will be a welcome update on the Plague Bearer one. Not really a model release, but they have their Poxrogue Vector battle force coming out fairly shortly, and this one was just really quite well received, with one of each of their demon engines plus some Terminators and Plague Marines. For the World Eaters, unfortunately they didn't receive the second release wave that many were hoping for. Instead they basically got a Slaughterbound and a Goremongers kill team. The Slaughterbound basically being a big 8-bound possessed by a Bloodthirster, and apparently has a special rule returning models to life. Not the worst for a leader model for them, but maybe not the single most exciting release, and not so different from what you could kit bash from 8-bound already. Otherwise, for their kill team release, they've had their Goremongers as some boosted Jackal Cultists, basically similar to them but with some bionic legs and some Bloodletter style trappings. I think they're fairly fun, though I feel like if World Eaters players had got to choose what kit they'd have released, they probably would have gone for something Space Marine related instead, as opposed to a second flavour of Cultists when they've only got quite a small range. For World Eaters' hopes and model possibilities, I feel like there was quite a lot of obvious gaps, maybe compared with the Death Guard specifically. It seems fairly likely that at some point down the line they might get some Red Butchers style Terminators, particularly given that Death Guard got two different flavours of Terminator. It looked like there was some Berserker Juggernaut cavalry seemingly teased in art with Lord Invocatus leading them. That sort of makes sense that if you're going to have a character riding a Juggernaut, you might have things for them to lead. There's the Berserker Surgeon that was very heavily teased in lore, the World Eater's Apothecary that maintains the nails and makes the 8-bound. And to be honest, given that they got a single character release, I was kind of surprised that it wasn't him, though it still predicts that he will turn up at some stage, maybe the next edition as a single character release if that's all they get. We had seen the Death Guard Lord of Poxes teased in the lore and their codex literally 5 years in advance. Otherwise, it would be really cool to see a sort of mid-sized Cornate Demon engine, perhaps something similar to a Blood Slaughterer in style, and it maybe seems less likely, but they could certainly give them bikers or jump troops if they wanted to. There'd be units that the Legion could field in the past, and don't really make too much sense why you couldn't have Khorne Berserkers riding those, and give them a bit of Legion-specific lore maybe. Their upcoming battle force will be the Gorestorm Slaughter Pack, the incredibly 8-bound heavy one, where it's lots of them, the Slaughterbound and some Jackals. Not really too bad if you're starting the Legion completely from scratch. That might be too many 8-bound or too many Jackals for players who have established collections though. For the Thousand Sons, they just had their Sekitar robots revealed, the sort of half Egyptian statue, half 40k robot kind of design. Let's say maybe wasn't received quite as well as it could have been. I feel like there's a pretty good range of opinions, some people absolutely hating them, some people being a bit mid, some liking them, but definitely hasn't been a slam dunk for Games Workshop. Kind of a shame that they weren't a little bit more universally popular, just given they've been waiting for some sort of model release besides a token character one for quite some time. Otherwise for their range, they're at least fairly well represented in the sort of HQ lineup. I feel like a few of their wishlist items are kind of similar to the Death Guard. More rank and file rubric variants would be kind of nice. A melee power armoured squad seems one of the most obvious things they could do. Perhaps with something like some shields or spears or similar. And again, they could also have a Havoc equivalent, maybe go heavy on those Soul Reaper cannons or Hellfire missiles. A Psycho Dreadnought would be really quite fun, maybe something like an Osiron one. You could do a proper demon engine of Tzeentch as opposed to something like the Mutalith Vortex Beast, which still is a bit telling as a port from Age of Sigmar really. And like the Death Guard, they'll be looking forward to a new Combat Patrol box set as well, likely coming pretty soon, and hopefully not quite so Zangor heavy. Otherwise though, we know for their big box set, that's the Warp Flame Thrallband, and goes heavy on those Sekitar robots, with some Scarab Occult, rubrics, and the Sorcerer pack. As it goes, this one was a fairly well received one, really quite a nice mix for people starting the faction, and going heavy on the new unit doesn't hurt. Finally for the Deity Legions, that just leaves the brand new one. The Emperor's Children release wave has gone for pre-order but not shipped out yet at time of recording. And in general, people were pretty happy with their range, particularly with the big interest kits being realised rather well. Fulgrim, Lucius and the Noise Marines all were pretty popular. Again, just matching up with the other Deity Legions, there's a lot of things that you could easily fill in for them. Unique Terminators would be another really enjoyed one. A Sonic Dreadnought or Hellbrute would be a really cool option. Slaaneshi Demon Engines, again to mirror the Death Guard ones. And then one thing that was maybe surprising that it didn't get was some sort of unique raised cultists. Though I'm not sure I want to find out exactly what they'll have done to their mortal followers. And to be honest, I'm not sure there's any massive reason that they couldn't just be given normal cultists with the models from Chaos Space Marines currently. Otherwise for the Forces of Chaos, we've got the Chaos Knights. They're going to be getting model reveals and codex release not so very long away. And Games Workshop do seem to have given us two really quite specific Chaos Knight teasers, a great big siege drill type thing and a massive flamethrower. Presuming that these are something like a further expansion for the Abhorrent Knight chassis, they could well be paired together on a new variant. So I guess might go for a sort of Siege Knight kind of style. It'd feel at least a little bit similar to the Acheron's vibe maybe. Otherwise, like the Imperial Knights, they're a fairly small faction. Again, one of the more obvious things could be to redo the Forge World Knights as for Imperials. Add some Chaos Knightly vassals or cultists. They've had that Grotmust detachment that allows them to ally in regular cultists. Otherwise, basically Games Workshop could exercise creativity. Always possible to make some completely different knight variants. You could have other ones that are more sort of Questoris / Abhorrent size, or maybe somewhere between there and a War Dog. You could do a named character Chaos Knight like Canis Rex for the Imperials, or you could do a Chaos Knight Tyrant. I sort of feel like that would be really quite a big commitment and perhaps seems a little bit unlikely. Finally for Chaos, we've got the Chaos Demons. It seems unlikely that they'll be getting any dedicated Warhammer 40k model release, given that for some reason Games Workshop's decided to take codex support away from them in 10th edition and just keep them realised and playing in-game by a digital index. It does make people apprehensive as to what might happen to them in 11th edition, whether or not they'll return to better support, or whether this really is Games Workshop trying to wind down the faction and break it up to the Deity Legions eventually. I guess it's not impossible they could get things from Age of Sigmar, but they don't always get those releases ported across to 40k. For obvious model releases they might want though, there's a bunch of retired resin that kind of needs rescuing, otherwise it's probably going to go to Legends fairly soon. The Blue Scribes of Tzeentch, Epidemius for Nurgle, the Transweaver for Slaanesh, and the Herald on Juggernaut for Khorne. Furies of Chaos were a nice cheap chaff unit that they had access to for quite a long time and then just suddenly went away. They could literally use the Warcry models for those if they wanted to. I feel like they're perfectly appropriate. The Spoilpot Scrivener official model is currently locked into a Sigmar Spearhead box, and otherwise for updated models, maybe things like Bloodletters or Demonettes could be ones to take a second look at. I feel like they could probably do something better with the Soul Grinder if they decided to have another go at that. Even outside of the resin things, they do have a fair few really quite old plastic kits in their range. It would be nice to see another Combat Patrol box set being released for them. It seems they've taken away the Khorne one, and doesn't really seem like there's much prospect of them getting another one in the near future, given they don't get Codex support and Combat Patrols have generally been coming out with the Codexes. Again, that feels like another step to sideline them in 40k. Feels like if anything, Chaos Demons as a faction just don't want to be losing their models, or their identity as a faction if they can. They've already had their Celeste Chariots removed for no really good reason given that they're still on sale. It sounds like their digital index might be in for another reckoning after the Deity Legion Codexes come out. Finally though, let's move on to the Xenos, and first up we have the Aeldari. They just had a really quite nice release wave with a whole ton of Aspect Warriors and Phoenix Lords that had been on the fan request list for literally decades, some of them. Nice to see a whole bunch of fine casts being updated and done really quite well. For Eldar miniature releases, maybe two of the most wanted and also most likely in my opinion are Karandras and Prince Iriel. They're two of the named characters that didn't get a plastic update in the Aeldari Codex and got removed from the book as a result, despite both being characters on a similar sort of fame and standing as all the other Phoenix Lords that they did. Karandras in particular, I'd be really surprised if he doesn't have a model release at some point. They clearly tasked some designers to basically resculpt all the aspects in the Phoenix Lords together. They've all been done in a similar style, and all the rest of the aspects have had their Phoenix Lords essentially released more or less alongside. It just seems they've decided to utilise the Striking Scorpion models differently, giving the Striking Scorpions a release in a Kill Team kit, and seemingly saving Karandras for a future release. I don't know if he might just be a token model release in 11th edition, or an end edition campaign miniature feature. Kind of annoying that he's been kept back a bit, but I strongly suspect that he might return by the Aeldari 11th edition codex, if not sooner. Otherwise, Iriel's Iandin's unique character, and quite a big figure in the Aeldari lore. Again, he feel like he'd be kind of perfect for a standalone miniature release or feature in a campaign. I believe there have been some rumours of a Corsair release wave featuring him at some stage. That would be cool if so, but would kind of seem surprising so close to an Aeldari Phoenix and Aspect release wave. Beyond those two though, there's a vast amount of other things that they could still do for the Aeldari, now they've actually covered the majority of things that they desperately needed to do. Some of their oldest plastic kits are things like the Falcon Grav Tank and the Viper. I feel like the Falcon's aged really quite well, the Viper jet bike feels like they could do that better if they took a second look at it now. There's a load more character possibilities that feel like they'd be a lot less likely than the previous two, but again none of them would be massively surprising. You could have the Autarch Skyrunner turn up, as he was a unit option until recently. The Bone Singer from Dawn of War, maybe make them like an Aeldari Tech Marine pretty much. The Shining Spears have a lesser known Phoenix Lord that's never had a miniature. They had some rules for Ayana Arianel, a named Spirit Seer of Iandin, and the Rangers no longer have a leader choice anymore. You could release the Amelin Shadow Guide model from Blackstone Fortress, or a new Illic Night Spear if they'd like to give them one. I'd be surprised if they actually got a major release wave for quite some time now. They did well both out of 9th and 10th. But for other fun stuff, they could do the Exodites as a pretty cool kill team. That's been a fan desire one for a long time. They do have quite a lot of sub-ranges of Space Elves on the go already though. If they wanted to develop the Harlequins further, maybe they could do something like an Avatar of Segarak or similar. No idea what form that'd take, but he is an existent Aeldari god. Forge World has a lot of possibilities, maybe things like the Hornet, some of their other Grav tanks, or maybe the Shadow Spectres and their Phoenix Lord which got sent to Legends in the not too distant past. And then he could further develop the other flavours of Aeldari, expand the Corsairs with maybe some options from their previous Forge World rule set, or try and further develop the Inari as a more major thing, though it sounds like they've been rather sidelined. So far they've just got their 3 characters. I feel like something like a unique infantry choice could be kind of fun, and could just help unify their identity a bit more as opposed to just Craftworld and Drukhari smashed together. Speaking of the Darkkin, they're perhaps the 40k faction that's most in need of a proper range release. Games Workshop made a lot of their units in Finecast Resin, and many of which just were kind of terrible for their purpose even when they existed. The Beastmaster and Beast, Grotesques, and Court of the Archon were all Finecast model kits that you basically needed to buy individually to make a big unit of them. And even when they existed, it was kind of horrendously expensive to build a unit if you went the official Games Workshop way, so loads of people tended to convert anyway. I suspect that probably correlated with them not selling very many of them, so they're just full on unavailable to buy now, along with Yuri and Rakarth as well, the Master Homunculus. Hopefully given Drukhari have a codex release late in 10th edition, that could be some sort of sign that they might get a proper release wave. The later codexes tend to have a better chance of that happening. They are in the place where they basically need 4 mainline kit releases just to stay where they are, though it was helpful to get the Mandrakes as a kill team. From a sprue leak, we know that Lady Malice is getting a model. Kind of fun to see her turn up, sort of the Drukhari Archon who's aligned with Segarak and is in command of the Poison Tongue Cabal. I believe we've only seen sprue leaks of her so far, though this is a rough recreation by arranging the parts that we could see on the sprue. And there are a bunch of other Drukhari named characters such as Duke Slisus or Karajirak that they could do if they wanted, though I feel like individual extra named character releases aren't really the priority versus their core stuff currently. If they wanted to push the boat out and give Drukhari some big centerpiece kit support, they could eventually get around to doing Astra Vex, one of the big bad mighty threats of Warhammer 40k in general, and would probably be resplendent on his days of destruction, overseeing his troops in battle. That's probably already more than enough to be going on with, but for other things perhaps a new Archon model wouldn't exactly go amiss. The plastic one they released with the sort of weird pose where he's crossing his weapons across his chest was a bit of an unusual choice, and again you could dig into their recently removed Forge World kits if they wanted to, perhaps with the Reaper or the Great Big Tantalus, though I feel like if they're going to give them a big centerpiece, then probably Vector be the one to go for rather than the Tantalus, though I guess if they wanted they could maybe make it a dual build thing if they wanted to make his day as enormous. For the Tyranids, they've certainly eaten good in 10th edition, both in new kits and the western fringe of the galaxy it seems. Pretty well all the things that most needed updates got them, and now they've had another fun kill team release as well, with a bunch of Tyranid terrain and some new takes on the Raveners. That'll be coming out in that kill team Typhon box set. For next release on the wish list, there's maybe a fair few possibilities they could do. I'm not necessarily sure what seems most likely though. The Parasite of Mortrex was a kind of fun and unexpected one for them to get towards the end of 9th, and if they brought him back, there seems like there's at least some possibility that they could resurrect maybe some of their other sort of named Tyranids, things like the Doom of Malantai to devour your entire Aeldari craft worlds in Psychic Horror, or the Red Terror being a raised Ravener. Shrikes were one thing that people were suspecting might turn up alongside that Wings Prime that had its dramatic appearance in the Leviathan trailer, but so far no sign of Winged Warriors yet. We did have the Great Big Norn Emissary, but one thing that Tyranids don't have in plastic is a proper Titanic unit, maybe a Biotitan in plastic to rival things like the Guard Baneblade or Orc Stomper and things. Otherwise, as with a lot of armies, you could get inspiration from their Forge World models, things like Sky Slasher Rippers, the Leaping Hunter that is the Dimecharon, or maybe the Malanthrope, the sort of boosted Venomthrope thing that they have. And otherwise, in terms of model kit updates, I believe the Carnifexes might be the single oldest kit that they have in the Tyranid range now. Quite a fun kit and pretty modular, though I feel like it's one where they've maybe got room for improvement. The Gargoyles as well maybe aren't exactly particularly loved miniatures with their flying bases. Again, I feel like they probably could do them a bit better if they went for an update similar to the other sort of Endless Multitude style units. For the Genestealer Cults, I feel like they've got quite a nice, well-rounded and developed range for perhaps a slightly niche faction in the game. Perhaps the one thing that they don't need any more of is more unique character sculpts. They already had a big overabundance of those with their first ranged launch, and then with token character releases with the Reductus Saboteur and the Benefactus in 9th and 10th, that's only gotten more the case. Otherwise though, for model hopes and wishes, they feel like an army that could have all manner of different creativity applied to them. Maybe something like a Hades Breaching Drill equivalent unit could be all very appropriate for them. That feels like the right sort of mining and undermining sort of thing that they're known for. They did have that Tectonic Frag Drill terrain piece fortification thing in previous editions. I guess maybe they could have some sort of take on their sort of battle limo command thing. I'm not entirely sure how they'd reinterpret that from a quirky 90s Warhammer to their sort of more modern mining and mutations aesthetic that they've got going on, but could be interesting. Not exactly a model, but the Brood Brothers could probably do with a new datasheet. It does just seem an odd choice that they're locked to only being fielded in their allied attachment, and even then you can certainly assemble their kill team in a way that isn't really represented by any one guard unit. Even if they keep the allied guard units all locked to the one detachment, it still feels like they should be able to field their actual kill team unit outside of it. Otherwise though, you could have all manner of mutants with mining weapons, big or small. Other loose Imperial tech, or various flavours of devolved or half-evolved Genestealers. Maybe some sort of devolved horrors kind of similar to those Maelstrom ones that we saw for Necromunda could be kind of fun. Perhaps some more bestial and uncontrolled horrors to turn loose on the enemy. For the Orks, it seems that the internet's kind of hopeful that it might be the antagonist faction for 11th edition, and if so, that could mean a whole load of new kits for them. They do seem like they'd be a fairly logical choice as a popular faction, and if that was the case, I'd probably expect they might do a whole bunch of their sort of 5th edition era kits, things like Warbikers, Looters, Stormboys, Gretchen and Nobs for example, and make them all fit in with the sort of bigger, chunkier Ork boy aesthetic they've had going recently. Similar to, say, the new boys kits, the Beast Snaggers and the Tank Busters. Talking of boys though, they could do with having another go at the general purpose boys kit, as the monopose, 3 shooters and 5 choppers within the unit or something like that just isn't really particularly great for them. There likely needs to give them different loadout options, or even they could split them into 2 boxes. Otherwise, some of the most obvious things for updates would be the Finecast or metal characters that they had rotated out. Mad Dog Grotznik, the deranged painboy of the Death Skulls, Boss Zagstruck, the Stormboy leader, Captain Badrook, the Flashkit leader, and maybe Nazdreg of the Bad Moons. If the other miniatures came back, they'd be the only clan that didn't have model representation, though if they wanted to, they could re-release the Black Library Bad Moon boss as an alternative for them. Finally, an updated Weird Boy should almost certainly be on the cards for them, given that that's the very last remnant of Finecast resin in their range. I'd be kind of surprised if we got Old Zogwart, but you could have maybe a multi-build Weird Boy and him kit if you wanted to. Otherwise, Forge World has a bunch of good inspiration. Maybe the kit that people were most disappointed when it went away were the Grot tanks in particular. It would be quite fun to see them as an option, and it could be kind of fun to make a sort of Gretchen Revolution style detachment work. If they wanted to push their theme a bit, you could certainly make Gretchen so they could be kind of fielded on their own if you'd like to. The Bite Boss from the Forge World range I think was one of the other bigger missed things, though there was a fair few other things that they had. Otherwise, on most people's wish list would be a looted wagon. Orcs used to have rules for pirating and commandeering all sorts of other factions' vehicles and fitting a big loud gun on the top. I suspect they'd just go with a regular stock design. Maybe a looted Lehman Russ could be the chassis for it. That seems to be the most common when you see them depicted. I feel like that'd be very popular if it was made orky, and you could still use conversions for a bunch of other things out there. If the Beast Snaggers got releases, maybe something like a Squig Herder style unit for the Beast Snaggers could be fun, or maybe some sort of winged beastie. If they were to give them another big centerpiece kit, I'd really quite like to see a plastic Squigoth. That would be awesome. I feel like that would have a pretty cool and pretty different feel to, say, the Kill Rig. For the Necrons, they had their big range refresh in 9th edition, though even that still left a whole bunch of things that are more obvious things to get refreshed at some point. The current Finecast ones are super obvious, and I feel like they're pretty much guaranteed to get redone at some stage or another. The Catan shards of the Nightbringer and Deceiver redone Void Dragon style. If they manage to make them as cool as that, I'm sure they'll be very, very well received. And Trazyn the Infinite is really conspicuous as the only Finecast named character Necron to have survived the Purge when Amrakir the Traveller and the other ones went away, and as maybe one of the best followed and best loved Necron characters from the lore. He seems absolutely guaranteed to get a plastic resculpt at some point in the future. Otherwise, I'm sure the Locust Destroyers will get a redo. They redid the heavy one, but not the regular ones, and they're the last holdout of the Green Rod Necrons from their original release. Hopefully they'll be able to stretch to a Locust Lord at the same time, so they've got an HQ choice to lead. They could revive the other Necron named characters, though seems less likely than those first 3 or 4 things. Amrakir the Traveller's got some fun lore, as do Nemesaur Zandrek and Vargard Oberon. But there's definitely other possibilities for additions to the Necron HQ lineup. You could do a Flayer King to lead the Flayed ones, a regular Lord resculpt as a bit of a lieutenant for the Necrons. Maybe the Royal Warden has sort of usurped his role though, and a jump leader for the Triumph Praetorians to go around enforcing Zarek's will be helpful enough for them. They're often locked out of character combos and things as they are currently. Again, they've got some Forge World potentials as well. If you wanted more Canoptech creations, they could do some of their sort of centipede style ones with the Tombstalker or maybe the Wasp-like Acanthrites. I still feel like maybe the Necron Pylon is one of their most iconic Forge World models though. I suspect it wouldn't be very good in game if they treat fortifications in the same way, but I do think that they looked pretty epic. For the Tau Empire, it was nice to see the Auxiliaries get a proper refresh in 10th. That had been one of the weakest elements of their range for quite some time, and nice to see the Kroot range expanded with a couple of new options, including their Krootox Rampagers. I wouldn't really be too surprised if the Tau got a bigger release wave in 11th edition, just as a popular army that hasn't really had a mainline Tau release for quite some time. Kroot was certainly popular, though a big new wave of fancy battlesuits would probably be more so. For more obvious models to refresh, the Firesight team and sniper drones seem like a good one. Again, one of the last holdouts of Finecast resin in the range. They do feel like the sort of unit that's maybe a bit on the niche side, but the fact that they've survived this long maybe gives you a bit more hope that they might get redone as opposed to cut. It feels like stealth suits are a pretty old kit that I could easily see them having an update. They hail from the same sort of era as the sniper drones too, and then they could dig into some of their removed models, say Ornvar or Ornshi. Both the named ethereals seem kind of possible, and if they released new battlesuits, I really wouldn't be too surprised to see more Riptide variants, maybe doing something along the lines of the Forge World versions of those. They could just go for something completely new with a different flavour of Tau tech mounted on the Riptide suit. Forge World also has hazard suits and tetras and plenty of other options too as well. Otherwise, going a little bit more out there, a big central Kroot monster like a Greater Narlock I think would be really fun for them. You can get some big Krootox Rampager damage combos going, but they don't really have a particularly dedicated way to take down tough stuff like monsters and vehicles. It feels like they may be missing something like a Greater Narlock with a big gun on its back or something. You could do some sort of conversion kit to represent Farsight's 8. Realistically, you never have them as a model release as it's just too many battlesuits for one box set, but maybe it could be a fun option to have some unique looking battlesuits and no doubt inspire people to pick up a bunch more stuff. And with all the alien auxiliaries that they have, you could expand to either human ones or other ones to add into the fold. You could have a few humans fighting for the Empire, or maybe some other client species like the Nikazar. Those psychic space bears might be a bit more of a support piece, as it doesn't sound like they're actually that good for ground combat. Finally, that just leaves us with our last current 40k army, and that's the Leagues of Votann. They launched as a new faction and got a whole bunch of kits at the time, far more so than say World Eaters or Emperor's Children did, but at the same time people are strongly suspecting that they will have at least a smaller follow-up wave this edition to expand their roster a bit more. The single most obvious thing seems like jump infantry, given that we've already seen the design for that in the Hearth King Kill Team box for some reason. If they go by his loadout, it'd be Plasma Axe and Bolt Pistol, though they might have other options, and that's just a fairly common 40k trope that you might expect to get filled anyway. We had a couple of other rumour engines that at least look kind of possible for Votann, though nothing really 100% specific to give them away. Could be some sort of command and control type things, including a hologram projector. I don't know if that'd be some sort of central command unit. Feels like it's a bit diorama-y really. Aside from jump infantry, if trying to fill in 40k tropes into their roster, maybe something like a walker or a land speeder type unit could be options to go down. I feel like a crude combat walker or a big robot both would fit in very well with the Leagues of Votann's current tropes, and they did look like there was some speeder flyer tri-engine things on Codex cover art in the past, which might potentially be a hint, though could be nothing. Seems likely if they got another release wave, there'd probably be at least one other character to go alongside to. Kind of rare for Games Workshop not to do those as supporting releases. Fingers crossed they get something good though. We know their codex is in the not too distant future, though not right at hand, announced for sometime later in the year, maybe sort of autumn time. In any case, with the Xenos armies talked about, I'll leave that one there for now. Let me know any other thoughts or what you'd hope for your given faction down in the comments below. As always, I look forward to hearing your takes and ideas. Finally, just to round off the video, I'll cycle back to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. As mentioned, one option to get a 40k battlefield on the go that's really easy to store and transport with their folding cardboard system. As mentioned, their designs do come with some pros and cons. Storing flat is maybe the biggest selling point, fitting in a board game sized box set, which means that you can transport it easily from place to place, and it means that it'll store really tiny if you've not got too much space where you live. As ever, third-party terrain systems tend to be far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain, and the Titan's Terrain is at least relatively inexpensive compared with entire boards that you'd get elsewhere. Kind of similar to cheaper MDF offerings, cardboard constructions being a factor in that. One other positive is that it doesn't need any painting or assembly, ready to go straight away, which maybe isn't the worst for people who have limited time to paint stuff up, or want to preserve that time for their armies. The cardboard folding design does come with some trade-offs though. As you'd expect, it's a bit less sturdy and hard-wearing than plastic or MDF, given it's made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. It's not going to hold much weight, and you might struggle to set up models in the top floors of it. The grid layout can be a bit less flexible than some terrain systems out there. I'd probably recommend just a little bit of extra terrain to break up a couple of firing lanes if played for 40k purposes, though in general I think it does well enough for casual non-tournament games. In any case, for their sets that they have available, they've got a Forgotten Furnace one. This one's all Chaos Runes and Glowing Foundries. There's maybe a more normal Ruined City Shattered Hive style one, lots of bombed out buildings and armoured container style things. And then there's some more Verdant Ruins as an Overgrown Capital style one, mysterious ruins that could maybe fit for a fantasy or a grimdark setting. Each of those also has a great big expansion set of 2 tiles pushed together to make one big centrepiece building if you like. They're a bit extra. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave them links down in the video description. That's it for this one though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, with new ones out just about every day. If you'd like to support the channel, there's 40k affiliate discount links in the video description if you happen to be buying any model soldiers in the near future, and also the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to support a bit more directly. A few big benefits for that, including seeing certain videos early, occasional votes as to what comes next, and automatic entry into the monthly prize giveaways. If any of that sounds good to you, check out the link in the video description. In any case though, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.